On the morning of December 7, 1941, a 57-year-old Japanese admiral stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi and watched 350 planes disappear into the pale Hawaiian sky. His name was Isoroku Yamamoto, and he had spent years trying to prevent this moment. Not the attack itself that had been his plan, his meticulous, obsessive blueprint, born from a cold strategic logic that few of his colleagues fully understood. What Yamamoto had spent years trying to prevent was the war the attack was designed to begin. And now that it was beginning, as the radio crackled with the first jubilant reports from Pearl Harbor, the man who had architected Japan's most spectacular military triumph sat quietly and said nothing. Those who knew him well noted the absence of celebration on his face. What Yamamoto understood, and what the cheering officers around him did not, was the fundamental problem with what Japan had just done. The attack on Pearl Harbor had not crippled the United States Pacific Fleet so thoroughly as to prevent American retaliation. It had not destroyed the American aircraft carriers, which had been absent from the harbor that morning. And it had unified a divided American public behind total war with a speed and ferocity that no Japanese strategist had seriously planned for. Yamamoto had, by the accounts of those closest to him, predicted all of this. In a letter written in 1940 to a Japanese nationalist who had been demanding a harder line against America, he wrote with unusual candor, "Should hostilities once break out between Japan and the United States, it would not be enough that we take Guam and the Philippines, nor even Hawaii and San Francisco. To make victory certain, we would have to march into Washington and dictate the terms of peace in the White House. I wonder if our politicians who speak so lightly of a Japanese-American war have any confidence of the final outcome." This was not the language of defeatism from a coward. Yamamoto was the most decorated, the most operationally brilliant admiral in the Imperial Japanese Navy. He had studied at Harvard. He had lived in the United States and understood its industrial capacity in a way that most of his colleagues had not bothered to. He had seen the oil fields of Texas and the steel mills of the Northeast with his own eyes. He knew what Japan was about to pick a fight with. And yet here he was, the architect of the attack he had spent years warning against. The story of how Japan lost the Pacific War is, in many ways, the story of Isoroku Yamamoto, a man who understood exactly why his country could not win, who designed the strategy most likely to give it a fighting chance anyway, and who watched that strategy unravel against the very forces he had predicted would destroy it. But it is also the story of a nation that had mistaken a series of early victories for proof of its own invincibility, that had confused tactical brilliance with strategic wisdom, and that had built an empire on a foundation that could not hold the weight placed upon it. To understand why Japan lost, we have to go back to well before the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor. We have to go back to what Japan was, and what Japan believed itself to be. In the 1930s, Japan was a nation in the grip of a particular and dangerous mythology. It had been a feudal society until the Meiji Restoration of 1868, when a new government had looked at the Western colonial powers carving up Asia and made a decisive choice. Japan would modernize or Japan would be consumed. In the 70 years that followed, the transformation was staggering. By the time the Second World War began, Japan had a modern industrial economy, a professional military, a steel industry, a navy that had defeated Imperial Russia at Tsushima in 1905 in one of the most complete naval victories in history. But the mythology that had grown alongside this transformation was dangerous precisely because it was partially true. Japanese soldiers and sailors genuinely were among the most disciplined, most tenacious, most self-sacrificing fighting forces on Earth. The culture of Bushido, the warrior's code, had been deliberately revived and institutionalized by the Meiji state as a tool of national unity, and it produced soldiers who would endure hardship and die for their emperor with a ferocity that repeatedly shocked their opponents. At Guadalcanal, at Iwo Jima, at Okinawa, American commanders would encounter Japanese defenders who fought to the last man in positions that any rational military calculation would have long since abandoned. This was not fiction, but it was not sufficient. The problem was that the Japanese military and political establishment had taken the genuine fighting quality of its soldiers and sailors and extrapolated from it a conclusion that the facts did not support, that spirit and determination could overcome material deficiency, that the force of Japanese will was a strategic asset that could substitute for oil, steel, aircraft, and logistics. This belief, which ran through Japanese military planning like a structural flaw through a bridge, was called Seishin, the doctrine of spiritual power. And it was going to
get millions of people killed. To understand how this belief had calcified into something approaching institutional religion, you have to understand what had happened in the years leading to the Pacific War. Japan had been expanding militarily since the early 1930s. In 1931, the Guangdong Army, the Japanese force stationed in Manchuria, had essentially staged an Inbapuni operation, manufacturing a pretext to invade and occupy Manchuria without direct authorization from Tokyo. The civilian government had been powerless to stop it. The military had gotten away with it. The operation had been a success. In 1937, Japan had launched a full-scale invasion of China, had seized the major coastal cities, including Shanghai and Nanking, had not, however, won the war. China was too large, its interior too vast, its population too numerous, for Japan to subdue completely. The Japanese army found itself bogged down in occupation that consumed enormous resources: men, munitions, oil, food, thus producing a decisive victory. By 1941, roughly 1 million Japanese soldiers with Taiwan and China in conflict had numerous blend. This is the context in which the decision for war against the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands must be understood. Japan needed oil. The war in China ran on oil. The Imperial Navy ran on oil. Japanese aircraft ran on oil. And in 1941, the United States, responding to Japan's invasion of southern Indochina, had imposed a comprehensive oil embargo. Japan had strategic petroleum reserves that its planners estimated would last roughly 2 years at current consumption rates. After that, the fleet would sit immobile in its harbors. The army would stop moving. The decision, therefore, was presented to Japanese leadership not as a choice between war and peace, but as a choice between two kinds of defeat. They could accept American terms, which would have required withdrawal from China and an end to a broader expansion as China, and face national humiliation, the abandonment of everything the military had fought and died for over a decade. Or they could go to war, seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, and build a defensive perimeter across the Pacific that would make the cost of reconquest too high for the Americans to pay. The plan had a name. The Japanese called it the Southern Resource Zone Strategy. The idea was not to defeat the United States outright. Japanese planners were under no illusion that this was right, but to inflict enough early damage on American naval power to allow Japan to consolidate its gains and negotiate a peace from opposition's gains. Yamamoto understood this logic and, up to a point, accepted it. But his version of it was more extreme and more desperate than the conventional naval liege planned. Yamamoto's anti, and it was a Jamuji infi, even if it ultimately failed, was that Japan to not win a prolonged war attrition against American industrial power. The numbers were simply not there. In 1941, the United States was producing steel at roughly 12 times the rate of Japan. American oil production dwarfed Japan's. American industrial capacity, if mobilized for war, would eventually produce aircraft, ships, and equipment in quantities that no amount of Japanese fighting spirit could overcome. Yamamoto knew this. His solution was to try to end the war before that mobilization could take effect. The attack on Pearl Harbor was not, in his conception, simply a tactical opening strike. It was an attempt to destroy American naval power in the Pacific so thoroughly and so swiftly that the United States would conclude that the cost of full reconquest was not worth paying, that a negotiated settlement, leaving Japan with its new empire intact, was preferable to years of bloody campaigning across the vastness of the Pacific Ocean. This calculation had two fatal weaknesses, and Yamamoto almost certainly knew them for. The first was that the attack had to be truly devastating, not merely damaging, but so catastrophic to American naval strength that the United States could not mount a serious counteroffensive for years. For that to happen, the aircraft carriers had to be destroyed. They were not in Pearl Harbor on December 7th. The carriers, the USS Enterprise, the USS Lexington, the USS Saratoga, were at sea, and the battleships that were destroyed, those symbols of naval power, were already becoming obsolescent in a war where aircraft carriers had revealed themselves as the dominant instrument of naval combat. The second weakness was psychological and cultural, and it was the more fundamental of the two. Yamamoto had lived in America. He knew that the attack would not demoralize the American people or make them conclude that the price of war was too high to pay. He knew that they had written explicitly, "I would unify them." What he could not do was make his superiors and his government understand this, because what was required to understand it was an honest assessment of the enemy. An honest assessment of the enemy were not something the Japanese military political establishment had any institutional mechanism for producing. This was not simply arrogance, though there was arrogance in it. It was a product of a decision-making culture that had, over decades, evolved in ways that made accurate strategic analysis almost impossible. Junior officers did not contradict senior officers, and senior officers did not contradict the political consensus, even when the fact meant it. Assent within the military was not merely discouraged, in context it was physically dangerous. Officers who expressed doubts about Japanese capabilities or who questioned the Spanish program had been, in multiple document instances, associated by nationalist extremists within the military itself. The atmosphere was one in which institutional self-deception had become a matter of survival. Yamamoto was one of the very few men in the Imperial Japanese Navy with both the stature and the moral courage to state the truth blindly. And even he, in the end, had planned the attacks it spent years worrying against. The attack on Pearl Harbor killed 2,403 Americans and wounded nearly 12 or more. It sank or damaged 18 naval vessels, including 8 battleships, and destroyed 188 aircraft. It was by the standard of a surprise attack and extraordinary tactical achievement, and by the morning of December 8, 1941, it had already failed in its most fundamental strategic purpose. President Franklin Roosevelt addressed a joint session Congress and asked for a declaration of war. Congress voted. The United States was in the war. What happened in the 6 months that followed Pearl Harbor is crucial to understanding the arc of Japan's defeat, because it illustrates with almost clinical precision the difference between tactical success and strategic wisdom. Across those first 6 months, Japanese forces achieved a string of victories that remained, in its geographic scope and its speed, one of the most remarkable military campaigns of the modern era. In December 1941 and January 1942, Japanese forces seized Guam, Wake Island, and the Gilbert Islands. They landed in the Philippines, pushing General Douglas MacArthur's forces back onto the Bataan Peninsula, invaded Malaya and drove the base southward toward Singapore, which found February 15, 1942, at the surrender of the A-5000 Wake, Admiral and ending troops and were Winston Churchill titled the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. They seized Rangoon and pushed into Burma. They landed in the Dutch East Indies and captured the oil fields of Borneo and Sumatra that the entire campaign had been designed to secure. By the spring of 1942, the Japanese Empire stretched from Manchuria to the borders of India, from the Central Pacific to within striking distance of Australia. In roughly 4 months, Japan had conquered a territory of roughly 3 million square miles at a population of approximately 30 million people. No empire in history had expanded so far so fast, and it was already dying. To understand why Japan's early victories contained the seed as defeat, you have to understand something about the nature of the empire Japan had as creed. It was not a coherent economic entity. It was not a defensible territory. It was a vast, dispersed clash of island and coastlines collected by sea lanes that stretched across thousands of miles of ocean. Sea lanes that Japanese planners had, by their own assessment, only the naval power to defend for a limited time. The Southern Resource Zone, the oil, rubber, and raw materials of Southeast Asia that were the entire justification for the war, could only be brought home to Japan across those sea lanes, and those sea lanes were exposed. The Allies, given time, would have the submarines to interdict them, the aircraft to bomb them, the naval power to keep them entirely. Japan's new empire was, from the beginning, an empire that depended on the one thing that Yamamoto had been trying to destroy at Pearl Harbor and had failed to destroy: Allied naval and air power. And at February of 1942, the magnitude of this problem was about to become impossible to ignore. Yamamoto had stood from the beginning that the window of Japanese strategic advantage was narrow. He reportedly told members of the naval general that he could run wild to 6 runs to a year, but that after that he could make no promises. He was trying to compress the war into that window. He needed to find and destroy the American carriers before the American industrial machine had time to produce the replacements. He needed to force a decisive battle. The plan he designed for the summer of 1942 was the attack on Midway Atoll. On the surface, it was a complex and ambitious operation. A diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands in Alaska would draw American attention north, while the main Japanese force, 4 fleet carriers, 7 battleships, and doubling supporting vessels, would attack and seize Midway, forcing the American carriers to come out and fight. Yamamoto would be waiting with overwhelming force. The carriers would be destroyed. The war would be won or at least winnable. What happened at Midway between June 4th and June 7th, 1942, did not follow this script. The Americans drew feet signal intelligence with the Guadalcanal station HYPO in Pearl Harbor deserved most of the credit. Had broken the Japanese naval code to know that the attack on Midway between roughly when between and roughly 4th. Admiral Nimitz to 19 Pacific Fleet from Fort Horty, to addition to 3 Hillbill Terriers, the Enterprise, the Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, in ambush northeast of Midway. On the morning of June 4th, Japanese aircraft attacked Midway. While the attackers were returning, and while Japanese aircraft were being rearmed on the flight decks of the carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, a moment of extraordinary vulnerability, with Hugh lines running across the decks and bombs stacked in the open, American dive bombers arrived overhead. Within approximately 6 minutes of concentrated attack, 3 Japanese fleet carriers were fatally damaged. A 4th, Hiryu, was sunk that afternoon. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers. The United States lost 1. The Yorktown sunk by Japanese submarine. More importantly, Japan had lost over 3,000 experienced male aviators at aircrew. Men who had trained for years and who could not be quickly replaced. The United States had lost 147 aircraft and their crews. It was a loss the United States could absorb. Japan, it turned out, could not. Yamamoto, commanding from the battleship Yamato at a distance from the battle that reflected both the strategic conception and the inadequacy of Japanese communications, received the news of the carrier losses late in the day. He attempted to continue the operation. By the evening of June 4th, it was clear that no continuation was possible. He ordered the fleet to withdraw. He later repeatedly told his chief of staff, "I'm the only one who must apologize to His Majesty." He never spoke publicly about Midway. The Japanese government concealed the extent of the defeat from the Japanese public for the remainder of the war. The survivors to the battle were created with the drawback to brought to truth to spring. This was the second decisive failure of Japanese strike. The systematic concealment of military reverses from the people, the political leadership, and, in many cases, from the military leadership itself. The culture that had made honest strategic itself impossible before the war continued to make honest assessment possible during. Reports were falsified. Losses were minimized. Successes were exaggerated. When the government could not hide a defeat, it reframed. When it could not reframe, it simply did nothing. The consequences of this institutional dishonesty were not merely political. They were operational. Commanders at one level of the chain of command often did not know what was actually happening at another. Resource allocations were made on the basis of optimistic assumptions that the facts did not support. Plans were constructed on foundations that had already crumbled. Yamamoto knew the truth about Midway, where he may not have fully grasped. What perhaps no one in the Japanese High Command fully grasped in the summer of 1942 was that Midway had not simply cost Japan 4 carriers and 3,000 men. It had cost Japan the only strategic window in which it had ever had a realistic chance of forcing the war to a conclusion on favorable terms. The window had closed. The war would now be fought on American terms, on a timetable set by American industry. Across the Pacific Ocean that American carriers and American submarines would come, inexorably, to dominate. It would take 3 more years and approximately 3 million Japanese lives for that conclusion to be reached. In the months after Midway, Isoroku Yamamoto did not stop working. He could not afford to. The Japanese defended Prima, a vast arc of islands, sea lanes that ran for the Aleutians and north down through South Pacific, east through Gilbert and Marshall Islands, south through the Solomons, New Guinea, and west through the Dutch East Indies, at beyond. The logic was still the same logic that had driven the entire Southern Resource Zone strategy from the beginning. Inflict enough casualties on the Americans that they would conclude the reconquest of the Pacific was too costly, and negotiate. The puzzling was that the arithmetic of the strategy had already turned against Japan, and was turning faster than anyone in Tokyo was prepared to acknowledge. In August 1942, United States Marines landed on the island of Guadalcanal in the southern Solomon Islands. What the American High Command expected to be a relatively swift operation to seize a partially constructed Japanese airfield turned into a 6-month campaign of extraordinary violence and attrition, fought simultaneously on land, at sea, and in the air. The Americans clung to Anderson Field, the airfield that was the campaign's strategic prize, while the Japanese mounted 7 major naval engagements and a series of grinding landmasses 3 islands Jung interior. The campaign revealed something that would define the entire arc of the Pacific War to that point forward. The campaign's military was composed tamtil Lefland, individual heroism, and ferocious local resistance in all his days. Why was not capable of was replacing his losses. The naval battles around Guadalcanal cost both sides heavily in ships and men, but Japan also lost in those 6 months somewhere between 800 and 1,000 experienced naval aviators. These were not men who could be quickly replaced. Japan's pre-war naval aviation training program had been demanding to the point of exclusivity. It selected perhaps 1 candidate in 30 who applied, and the full training cycle for a fleet aviator took years. By contrast, the United States had already expanded its training programs enormously and was producing aviators in the thousands. When the Americans lost pilots over Guadalcanal, they grieved and moved on and replaced them. When Japan lost pilots over Guadalcanal, it lost irreplaceable institutional knowledge, irreplaceable skill, irreplaceable human capital, and began the process of replacing experienced aviators with men who were not ready. The consequences of this would not fully manifest until 1944, when undertrained Japanese pilots flew into American fleet air defenses and died in numbers so catastrophic that American sailors watching from their ships called it the Marianas turkey shoot. But the root cause of that catastrophe was planted on the air bases of Guadalcanal and Rebel in the second half of 1942. Japan withdrew from Guadalcanal in February 1940. Die Announcement in Folkuelentage of the strategic withdrawal and a change in operational posture. The reality was that Japan had been defeated in its first serious attempt to hold part of its defensive perimeter against sustained American pressure. Henderson Field remained in American hands. Japanese forces suffered approximately 24,000 dead, the majority from disease and starvation. A detail that speaks to a logistics system that was already struggling to maintain forces even on islands relatively close to Japan's main supply route. It was in this context, in April 1943, that Isoroku Yamamoto made the decision that would end his life. He had been conducting a series of air operations from Rebel, the major Japanese base of New Britain, attempting to achieve American air power in the Solomons for the next America then watched. The operations Aid Igulf Hussein had claimed more outcry than Japan could easily afford to lose. Then the results were being sufficiently obfuscated and the reports region Taukat. Japanese pilots, under enormous pressure to show results, were reporting ships sunk and aircraft destroyed in numbers that bore little resemblance to actual American losses. Tokyo believed the reports. Yamamoto knew they were exaggerated. But the institutional pressure to produce good news was immense and relentless. On April 13, 1943, the schedule of Yamamoto's planned inspection tour of forward bases in the Solomons was transmitted in a coded message from the Japanese base at Rebel. The code used was JN-25, the primary Japanese naval operational cipher. The message detailed Yamamoto's precise itinerary, its Pretritimos aircraft, the route, the split-in arrival times at each stop. American cryptanalysts, a station HYPO, read the message. They passed it up the chain of command. Admiral Nimitz, after consultation with Washington, authorized an interception mission. 15 P-38 Light fighters of the United States Army Air Forces 3 and 39 phase water through low altitude. Literal precise, radar-side mission of approximately 50 miles after open ocean to intercept Yamamoto Shansburg Hikkuth it was with scheduled to Wahil Washington. On the warning of April 18, 1943, exactly 16 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, 2 Mitsubishi G4M transport aircraft carrying Yamamoto as staff appeared over the jungle of Bougainville right ago. The P-38s are waiting, In Egain, the fired Yamamoto's aircraft was shot down. His body was found to the tunnel the following day, still seeing tear. His white-gloved hand gripping his ceremonial sword. He was 59 years old. The Japanese government withheld the news as death from public for 5 weeks. When they finally announced, he presented as a death in coma during full inspection, which was accurate for the wind. It had nothing capili the misshare been caught by America through his intelligence, or what that compromise revealed about the fate of Japanese operational security. The loss of Yamamoto was significant not simply as the death of a brilliant commander, though it was that. It was significant because of what it demonstrated about the structural vulnerability of Japan's strategic position. The Americans had intercepted and decoded the message scheduling his tour. They had flown a 600-mile precision mission to kill him. They had succeeded. Every element of this, the intelligence capability, the long-range aircraft, the navigational precision, the operational planning, was a product of American industrial and institutional capacity that Japan could not match. Yamamoto had known this. He had spent his career known this. And now the system he had known was unbeatable and reached out across 600 miles of Pacific Ocean and killed him with what, in operational terms, amounted to a routine interceptor mission. His pastoral Admiral Manashi Koga, a command officer who understood that the strategic situation would deteriorate and who had no idea had done it. By 1943, the underlying mathematics of the war were becoming impossible to conceal even within the Japanese military's own internal communications. The problem was not any single defeat or any single shortage. It was the convergence of multiple systems failing simultaneously, each failure accelerating the others. The first and most fundamental failure was oil. Japan had gone to war specifically to secure the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, and it had succeeded in capturing those fields in early 1942. The oil was there. The problem was getting it home. The sea lanes between the Dutch East Indies and the Japanese home islands ran for thousands of miles through waters that were increasingly patrolled by American submarines. Japan's merchant marine, the tankers and cargo ships that were the circulatory system of its empire, was being destroyed faster than it could be replaced. American submarine warfare in the Pacific was, by the middle of the war, one of the most effective strategic campaigns in military history. In 1942 alone, American submarines sank approximately 580,000 tons of Japanese shipping. In 1943, that figure rose to approximately 1.5 million tons. By 1944, it was exceeding 2 million tons per year. Japan's ability to build replacement merchant vessels was nowhere near sufficient to compensate for these losses. The practical consequences cascaded through every aspect of Japan's war effort. Less oil in Japan meant less fuel for aircraft. Less fuel for aircraft meant fewer training hours for pilots. Fewer training hours meant less skilled pilots. Less skilled pilots meant higher combat loss rates. Higher combat loss rates meant even less oil needed for even fewer aircraft in an ever-tightening downward spiral. Less oil also meant less fuel for the surface fleet. The magnificent battleships and cruisers that Japan had built at such enormous expense were increasingly unable to put to sea. Either because they had no sue or to seal the hit had to be conserved for operating of immediate necessity. Less shipping also meant less food. Japan's home islands are not naturally self-sufficient in food production, and the empire's agriculture depended on imports of fertilizers and farming equipment that moved by sea. By 1944, civilian food rations in Japan had been cut to levels that nutritionists later estimated were insufficient to maintain adequate health in long term. By 1945, in some urban areas, had been cut to levels approaching starvation. That was not happening to the United States. The contrast between the two nations' materials of Wayne, which Yamamoto had understood theoretically before the war, was now playing out in operational reality in a way that was observable to anyone willing to look at the facts honestly. American industry was producing, in 1943 and 44, roughly 90,000 aircraft per year. Japanese industry was producing roughly 28,000. The United States launched approximately 140 naval vessels of destroyer size or larger in 1943 alone. Japan launched approximately 40. American workers were building Liberty ships, standardized cargo vessel, at a rate that, at the peak of production, was approaching one new ship every day. The Japanese soldier fighting in the jungles of New Guinea or on the atolls of the Central Pacific was fighting with equipment and supplies that arrived intermittently, in quantities that were never sufficient, carried by ships that were being sunk at a rate the empire could not sustain. Care was being asked to do with his personal car at his willingness to die, what his country's industrial system was unable to do for him. This was station taken to its logical, catastrophic conclusion. Spirit had been asked to substitute for steel, and the steel was winning. The American strategy that Yamamoto had always feared, the systematic, methodical advance across the Pacific fueled by an industrial capacity that Japan could not match, was by 1943 operating on two parallel axes. In the Southwest Pacific, General Douglas MacArthur was advancing along the northern coast of New Guinea toward the Philippines, leapfrogging Tapanage Strela Point and cutting supply line. In the Central Pacific, Admiral Nimitz was implementing the island-hopping campaign that would bring American air and naval power within striking range of the Japanese islands. The island-hopping strategy was, in conceptual simplicity, a direct response to the technical reality that Guadalcanal had demonstrated. A fully garrisoned Trapeze Island strong point, properly constructed with tunnels and bunkers and mutually supporting fields of fire, the active rope was pried from a attacking horse. A direction is not to attack every such strong point, but to select those strategically significant islands that would share the air and naval bases to the Guadalcanal, capture them at Guadalcanal's density, and leave the remaining Japanese garrisons isolated and unable to affect the war's outcome. The consequences for those isolated garrisons were grim. Japanese forces on bypass islands, rebound, truck, WWII, dozens of smaller atoms were left without resupply, their men slowly dying of malnutrition and disease, unable to contribute to Japan's defense, unable to be evacuated, unable to surrender in any meaningful numbers because of their military prohibited, and was a form of strategic slow murder, and the Japanese High Command had no effective answer to it. The battles that were fought on the islands that American planners did choose to take illustrated, with terrible clarity, what Japan's strategic situation had become. At Tarawa in November 1943, 4,800 Japanese defenders held a tiny atoll against the full force of an American amphibious assault for 76 hours. When it was over, 17 Japanese soldiers had been taken prisoner. The rest were dead. The Americans had suffered over 3,000 casualties taking an island that was, in itself, of limited strategic value. Its value was as an airfield site and a rehearsal for future, larger operations. At Saipan in June and July of 1944, 31,000 Japanese defenders of the Marianas Islands died holding an island that Japanese planners had designated as part of the obsolete defense sphere, the inner perimeter beyond which, they had publicly declared, the enemy would not be permitted to advance. When Saipan fell, it did not just represent the loss of a strategically vital island. It brought the American B-29 Superfortress bombers, with their range of over 3,000 miles, within striking distance of the Japanese home islands. The bombing of Japan itself, which would eventually reduce most of its major cities to ash, now became a practical proposition. The fall of Saipan also had major political consequences in Tokyo. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, who had led Japan into the Pacific War and who had maintained his position through a combination of political maneuvering and the suppression of unfavorable military information, was forced to resign. The emperor himself, who had until that point maintained the formal posture of constitutional non-involvement in military decisions, began to make clear to trusted advisors that he believed the war could not be won. The question now being asked in the corridors of Japanese power, quietly, carefully, because asking it too loudly could still be dangerous, was not whether Japan could win. It was whether Japan could survive. In the air above the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the consequences of Japan's pilot train collapse arrived in full. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, which American carrier pilots would call the Great Marianas Tugueju, with the decisive fleet air engagement into Japanese had been trying to force with Midway, and that now arrived under circumstances entirely reversed from what they had hoped for. Japan committed 9 carriers and approximately 450 aircraft. The United States committed 15 carriers and approximately 900 aircraft. But the disparity in numbers was not the critical factor. The critical factor was the disparity in pilot skill that 3 years of unequal nutrition had created. Japanese pilots, many of them with as little as 300 hours of flight time, flew into the combat air patrols of American carriers whose pilots had thousands of hours of experience. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat, a fighter specifically to guide with intelligence out the Zero's capabilities incorporated into its engineering, was faster, better protected, and more powerfully armed than anything Japan's industry was currently producing in quantity. In the course of 2 days of air battle, Japan lost approximately 300 aircraft in air combat and an additional 50 from other causes. American combat losses were approximately 123 aircraft. 600 Japanese aircrew died. The aircraft carrier Taiho, Japan's newest and largest, was sunk by a submarine torpedo that ignited leaking aviation fuel vapors in a catastrophic explosion. 2 other carriers were sunk. After the battle, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the Japanese carrier force, reported to Tokyo that air groups essentially ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. The carriers remained. The pilots were gone. Japan's naval aviation, the instrument power that had struck Pearl Harbor, that had swept across the Pacific in the first month of the war, that had made Japan briefly the dominant military force in the largest ocean on Earth, was, as a coherent striking force, finished. What remained of Japan's strategic thinking after the Philippine Sea was no longer about winning. It was about making the cost of defeating Japan high enough that the Americans might accept a negotiated settlement rather than demand the unconditional surrender that Roosevelt had committed to at Casablanca in 1943. Every Japanese defensive plan from mid-1944 onward was built on a single calculation: kill enough Americans to make them negotiate. The calculation produced at its most distinctive expression the kamikaze. The word means divine wind, a reference to typhoons that destroyed Mongol invasion fleet, attempting to read to plan in the 13th century. The tactic was the product of a clear-eyed recognition that Japan's conventional air power could no longer effectively damage American fleet units in traditional attack profiles. A skilled American combat air patrol would intercept and destroy most conventional attackers before they reached their targets. A pilot who had accepted his own death, however, who flew his aircraft directly into the target rather than releasing a weapon from a distance, was statistically more likely to cause damage. The kamikaze were not, as American propaganda sometimes suggested at the time, fanatics acting from irrational relief. Many of them were young men, college students, and many cases, men with families and viewers, who'd been told that the sacrifice was the only thing in my single country, and that accepted that contortion the clarity and grief of the diaries and letters many of them left behind may heart beckon to read. One pilot, writing to his parents the night before his mission, told them that he was not afraid, but that he was sad, and that he wished they had had more time. He was 22 years old. The kamikaze were effective enough, in tactical terms, to be genuinely alarming to American commanders. They sank 26 American ships and damaged hundreds more. They killed nearly 10,000 American sailors. They delayed American operational timelines and caused the modification of tactical formations across the fleet. They did not change the outcome of the war, because the outcome of the war had already been determined by factors that no amount of individual sacrifice could address. The carriers kept coming. The submarines kept sinking the tankers. The B-29s kept burning the cities. By the spring of 1945, Japan was being destroyed methodically and comprehensively from the air. The B-29 raids conducted by General Kurt LeMay's XXI bomber command had shifted, in March of that year, from high-altitude precision bombing to low-altitude incendiary attacks against Japanese urban areas. The results were catastrophic. The raid on Tokyo on the night of March 9th and 10th, 1945, and 10th of nights worked by 345 B-29s dropping incendiary bombs on a city built largely of wood and paper, killed approximately 84,000 people and burned 16 square miles of the city to the ground. In the months that followed, LeMay's bombers systematically destroyed every major Japanese city. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, Yokohama, one by one they burned. By August 1945, American planners estimated that their strategic bombing campaign had destroyed approximately 60% of Japan's industrial capacity and killed somewhere between 200 and 250,000 civilians. Japan's ability to produce the weapons of war was collapsing. Its merchant marine had been reduced to a fraction of its pre-war size. Its oil imports had nearly ceased entirely. Its population was hungry, in many areas approaching genuine starvation. Its military was still formidable in terms of the willingness of its soldiers to die, and on the islands of Iwo Jima and Okinawa in the early months of 1945, American fighters have seen what meant to take territory with defenders who are determined to sell their lives as expensively as possible. But the defensive perimeter was contracting toward the home islands themselves, and the question of what an invasion of Japan would cost, in American lives and Japanese lives, in lives that civilians across Asia intend to die under Japanese occupation, had become the central question of the war's final chapter. It was the question that Isoroku Yamamoto had answered before the war began. He had said that if Japan went to war with the United States, Japan would have to fight all the way to Washington to win. Japan had not gone to Washington. It had not even been able to hold Midway. The end came in August 1945, through events that historians have debated ever since: the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Soviet declaration of war against Japan, the Emperor's unprecedented radio address announcing surrender. The specific weight of each factor in Japan's final decision to capitulate is disputed and probably unknowable with certainty. What is not disputed is the context in which those final blows fell. Japan surrendered because by August 1945, it had already lost everything that a nation can lose short of its physical existence. Its navy was on the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. Its air force was a ghost. Its merchant marine was destroyed. The cities were burning. Its people were hungry. The army that remained on the home islands was formidable in the only way Japan's military had ever been formidable, in the willingness of its men to die. But it faced opponents who had demonstrated, across 4 years and thousands of miles of ocean, that willingness to die was not the same thing as the ability to win. Japan's defeat had been written into the foundations of its strategy from the moment it chose war. Not because Japanese soldiers were not brave. They were extraordinarily brave, and the record of their extraordinary endurance is undeniable and deserves to be acknowledged. Not because Japanese commanders were not skilled. Some of them were among the most tactically gifted officers of the war. But because the war Japan chose to fight required resources Japan did not have, sustained over a timeframe Japan could not control, against an opponent whose capacity for production and recovery Japan had consistently and deliberately underestimated. Yamamoto had understood all of this. He had said so clearly and explicitly before this bomb fell. He'd been ignored, and then he'd been asked to plan the attack anyway, and then he had planned it brilliantly, and then he had watched it fail in exactly the ways he had predicted it would fail. He had relied on routine spectator because the code his country used had been broken. The aircraft to intercept him. The institutions that might have corrected the strategic errors and suppressed and multiplied and brilliant those institutions need to function. He had known. He had said so, and he had made no difference. There is a temptation, it looking back to Japan's defeated pathetic, find in it a neat moral lesson about hubris, or about the limits of military force, or about the ultimate supremacy of industrial power over martial spirit. These lessons are not wrong exactly, but they flatten something important. The men who made the decisions that led Japan into a war it cannot win without lose. Many of them understood at some level the odds they faced. They made the choices they made not from ignorance but from a combination of institutional constraint, ideological momentum, and the particular desperation of a nation that had no hurry. Yamamoto was often said as the voice of strategic reason that Japan failed to heed, and there is truth in that project. But Yamamoto was also, in the end, a product of the things that Kamikaze hide. He aligned the attack on Pearl Harbor. He commanded the fleet at Midway. He was flying a station tour over Buenho because he believed correctly that the initiative had to be maintained even when the resources to maintain it were running out. He was a man who knew the truth and acted anyway, not from recklessness but from duty, and perhaps from a soldier's unwillingness to abandon the field simply because the odds had turned against him. In this, he was more Japanese than he knew, or more human than the legend allows. The Pacific War ended on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Japanese officials in formal dress signed the instrument of surrender while the warships of the Allied fleet filled the harbor around them. General MacArthur, accepting the surrender, said, "It is my earnest hope, indeed the hope of all mankind, that from the solemn occasion a better world shall emerge." Yamamoto had been dead for 2 years and 4 months. He had known this day was coming longed for the ride. Whether he had hoped for something like MacArthur's bad world, or whether he had simply hoped his country might survive the war he had tried so hard to prevent, is a question the historical record does not answer. What it does tell us is that he had understood, before almost anyone else in a position of power in Japan, the nature of what his country was doing, and that understanding had not been enough to change anything. That may be the most sobering lesson of all.